Hello, I'm Colin Gale, and I'm sitting in the historic boardroom of Bethlem Royal Hospital, which is now within Bethlem Museum of the Mind, of which I am the director. 4 weeks ago, I sat here to launch the museum's virtual book club devoted to reading Presumed Curable, published back in 2003 and still available to order from the museum in the way described in that introductory video. At that time, I described the boardroom as being the institutional heart of Bethlem Hospital and the experiences of its patients as representing the true heart of the hospital. In closing out these series of videos, I want to talk about a patient who took the institution to his heart and an institution that took that patient to its heart more than most. In previous weeks, we have told the stories of people who were discharged recovered from the hospital, people who were discharged uncured, and even one who was not admitted to the hospital at all. It's time this week to consider the story of a patient who died while in the hospital. I hope you've had a chance to read all the way through to the end of Presumed Curable by now. The final 16 cases from pages 100 onwards were all admitted in the 2-month period between April and June 1895. And they feature 7 patients who were discharged recovered, 7 patients who were discharged uncured, and 2 patients who died in the hospital, each in very different circumstances from the other. On pages 124 and 125, the story of Gerard Aston makes for very sad reading, as did that of John Wicks back on pages 58 and 59, if you remember him. These are cases of death by misadventure, and we may have our suspicions, but we cannot be certain whether or not Aston or Wicks intended their own deaths. Both of these stories are sobering reminders that the hospital could take steps to minimize risk, but it could not eliminate risk entirely, especially when it had granted patients temporary leave to return home on an unsupervised basis. Of course, it's possible to argue that the hospital could have exercised better judgment in deciding when to grant temporary leave, or that it could have reduced the risk by not giving any of its patients temporary leave, whether or not it thought they were convalescing. That may be true, but the hospital was not a prison, and no doubt it felt a responsibility to promote recovery at the same time as manage risk. Anyway, that was something of a digression on my part, because as far as we know, neither John Wicks nor Gerard Aston were patients who took Bethlem especially to heart, or were taken to heart by Bethlem. That distinction belongs to Herman Muller, the last person to feature in Presumed Curable. Now, I don't intend to comment in detail on the circumstances that brought him from his teaching position in foreign languages at Whitgift School in Croydon to residence at Bethlem at the age of 52 in 1895. You can read about those circumstances yourself on pages 126 and 127 of the book. It's of more interest to me to note how he was treated as a long-term resident of the hospital. I mentioned 3 weeks ago that there were some exceptions to Bethlem's 12 months and you're out rule, whether recovered or not, and that the hospital maintained a small incurable ward. After he had spent 18 months at Bethlem, Herman was assessed for admission to that unit. As part of that assessment, the physician superintendent established 3 things. First, that he was unlikely to recover sufficiently to resume working or living at home. Second, that his wife was quite unable to pay for her husband in any asylum. And third, that he was a man of great culture and would feel most acutely the association of the pauper class in a county asylum. So on these financial, social, and cultural grounds, Herman Muller was transferred to Bethlem's incurable department in 1897, where he was cared for at the expense of the hospital until his death from natural causes in 1916. And that is all we find out about him from his medical records. But there is what is described in Presumed Curable as an intriguing postscript to the story. It's provided by Geoffrey O'Donoghue, who was Bethlem's chaplain, historian, and long-standing editor of the hospital magazine Under the Dome. In the March 1916 edition of the magazine, O'Donoghue writes as follows: "It was my sad privilege to say the last prayers and breathe a long farewell over the oldest of my friends in the hospital." He was speaking of none other than Hermann Muller. "In his best years, he was my constant companion and my valuable amanuensis," by which he means scribe. "In my early studies of the documents upon which my story of Bethlem Hospital was founded," that was the title of O'Donoghue's published history of Bethlem, "I was under the greatest obligation to his knowledge of languages, his accurate scholarship, and the neatness of his handwriting. So much said," O'Donoghue writes, "so much said and so much left unsaid to the memory of a hospital friendship." O'Donoghue went so far as to include a photographic portrait of his friend Hermann in a slideshow he put together on the history of Bethlem Hospital to accompany lectures on the subject. The image is reproduced on page 127 of Presumed Curable, and it's a sympathetic and carefully composed portrait of its subject in a way that could not be said of most of the other photographs in the book. If O'Donoghue was putting his slideshow together today, he would have used PowerPoint, and a previous generation probably would have used 35mm slides. But the technology available in his era was that of the glass lantern slide. And I have that original 120-year-old glass lantern slide here with me today, and I'm going to try to show it to you in this little video. And I hope I don't make too much of a mess of things. Gloves are important, and so is this light box for you to get a glimpse of the original slide. There it is there. I suppose this is not a very good look that you're getting of it, but at least you can be assured that we're taking good care of it here in the museum's collections. So this is where the history of the hospital begins to intersect with the history of one of its patients. The governors of Bethlem Hospital, those who met in this boardroom to make decisions about its running and its future, would all have known about Hermann, his story, and his association with Reverend O'Donoghue. Among their number would have been those who signed off on the cost of his care. Most poignantly, the hospital's board of governors was the body approached after Hermann's death by his son Eric. He wanted to establish a relief fund in memory of his father for patients being discharged from Bethlem in financial difficulty. £1,000, an incredible sum in those days, was donated by Eric to set up the fund in gratitude for the hospital's care of his father. This is what he wrote to the governors. "The generous reception which was accorded my father when he broke down in 1895 certainly enabled my mother to fight the battles of life on behalf of her children and herself in a manner which would not have been possible had my father been in less hospitable hands." And this is what the physician superintendent wrote back. "I know your father would not have wished anything better than to have given something to the ancient foundation where he spent so many years of his life, in peace and, I think, happiness." 100 years later, cheques were still being issued, or more likely bank transfers were being made, in support of mental health service users in financial distress and in the name of Hermann Muller. Well, I trust you have found the experience of reading Presumed Curable from beginning to end a valuable one. In so doing, you have paid sustained attention to a group of people who would have otherwise very easily have been lost to posterity, but whose experiences are important to remember. Now that our book club has come to an end, I would be very grateful if you'd be willing to fill out a short online survey, and that gives us valuable feedback about our book club. We've devised it here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind, and you'll find links to the survey in the comments below this video on YouTube and on Facebook, and also on Bethlem Museum of the Mind's Twitter account. If you'd like to receive a small gift through the post from the museum as a thank you for completing the survey, well, there's a place at the end of it to leave your name and postal address. The gift we'll send out is a copy of a booklet called The Weight of History, which we had printed here at the museum 4 years ago to support an exhibition on the history of the hospital. Thank you for taking part in our virtual book club, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you online. Goodbye for now.